Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. I know. It occurs in 9 AD, somewhere around September. We're not 100% sure exactly when it occurred. But what is fascinating about this battle is it is going to pit the organized might of Rome against what had previously always been the disorganized Germanic tribes. To start off with, and you guys already know that Germania had been pacified, but that there was a revolt in the Balkans that meant that most of the Roman legions had to leave that area, leaving only 3 legions, or about 36,000 total Romans. Now they're not all soldiers. All those people couldn't be soldiers. That'd be more than 3 legions, but it was soldiers, camp followers, people like that. And what's happening is the gentleman who is in charge of the Romans, his name was Publius Quintillus Varus. And Varus was a commander who was most well known for being brutal toward enemies. He's not the most experienced commander. He's not bad. He's just not the kind of guy you want in charge of a real important operation. And that's because the real important operation was in the Balkans. Germany was pacified, so you didn't have to have your greatest general there. And so Varus has about 36,000 troops. Most of them are infantry, but he does have some cavalry, right? Along with him, he has his Germanic auxiliaries or mercenaries. And these are led by Arminius. And we've already talked a little bit about Arminius. And what they're going to be up against is a bunch of Germans. Now what you notice is if you take a look here, Arminius shows up as the leader of the Germans. But at this point, he's the leader of the Roman auxiliary. That's going to tell you that there'll be a little shift during the battle. The Germans had somewhere around 18,000 men. We're not sure. It could have been a little more, it could have been a little less. They had some cavalry, but we don't know exactly how many. All right. What you have is a situation where Varus believes that he doesn't have to worry about Germany. As a matter of fact, he's going to move toward the Rhine and relative safety and encamp for the winter. No one fights during the winter. It's cold. And so that's what he's planning on doing. He is met by a bunch of German chieftains. And what they say to him is, can you please leave Roman soldiers with us for protection? Now Varus hears this and he thinks, wow, the Germans actually want us here. And so what he does is he basically gives each of these tribes a cohort, or a little over 400 men. And he says, okay, yeah, you guys march and you act like police officers for each of these individual villages, and the rest of the army is going to head back toward the Rhine. Well, what's interesting is this was a plan hatched by Arminius. Arminius is not a Roman. He looks like a Roman, he acts like a Roman, he is in charge of Roman legions, but his heart is German, and he is leading the resistance. That's awesome. So what's going to happen is Arminius, with the help of the German tribal leaders, the chieftains, they are going to, at a predetermined time, massacre the cohorts in their beds. And so what's going to happen, unbeknownst to Varus, he's going to lose about 5,000 men in one night. And he doesn't even know it. They're dead. Varus is heading toward the Rhine when he receives word that a rebellion in Germania has occurred. And the Germans are rising up. And some Germans want help, and some Germans are fighting other Germans. And so Varus talks to Arminius and says, is this happening? What should we do? And Arminius says, we need to go north. We need to quell this rebellion. And Varus, who's close friends with Arminius, agrees. And so they start to march. Instead of to the safety of the Rhine, they head north. As they're heading north, Arminius decides he is going to scout up ahead, because he knows a better path than the Romans would normally take. The Romans want to be in open territory because that's how Romans fight best. They want to be in fields. They like to camp in fields, right? They don't want to be anywhere where they don't know the territory or where they're bunched together. Arminius says, I know the territory. You know me, I'm your trusted friend. I think we should go up this route. And he sends them literally up this route through here. He says, I'll go first and I'll scout ahead. So what happens is Arminius leaves with his German auxiliaries. They're gone. What are they going to do? What are they going to do?
Ambush.
Yeah, they're going to ambush the Romans. All right? And that's going to cause some problems because initially the Romans are going to look and they're going to see their allies, and all of a sudden their allies are going to attack them. So here's what happens. What you see here is the Roman legions are slowly moving up this path. This is a road. And so they have to move in a column. All right? Not a lot of guys across. So this column stretches out anywhere between 2 miles and 20 kilometers. All right? And if you know math, that's also long. All right, so here's the thing. It's a long stretch of people. And they're going through these woods. And Varus isn't worried because Arminius is ahead of him checking it out. That's silly. This is not something you should do. He should have sent out his own troops. Eventually, he does send a few of his cavalry up ahead. But they get to one place right on this road. Hope you guys can see it. But unfortunately, on either side, there are hills and there's a heck of a lot of trees. What the Romans don't know is that the Germanic tribes are behind here. And within the trees, what they've done is they've created fences with chopped down trees. So that if you try to move through them, it's going to be difficult. Now, the Germans know how to get through them. But they're doing this purposely because they're trying to pin in the Romans. And so what happens is the Germans jump over these hills and they start the attack with javelins, which are little throwing spears, and they start to use things like slings. Now a sling is a piece of leather, you spin it around and it chucks either a rock or a piece of lead really fast. And it's extremely painful and it can kill you. But no matter what, it's going to ruin your day and it's going to disintegrate Roman formations. That's what the Germans wanted to do. They charged in from both sides and the Romans could not form into their normal military battle formations because there weren't enough of them. So they would turn to face the enemy, and not only are they facing javelins and sling stones, but also all of a sudden these Germans just charge in. And so what's happening is guys here are attacked, the guys in the back don't know what's happening because they're at least 2 miles away. You might hear someone screaming. You might hear the clang of metal and things like that, but you're not 100% sure what's going on. Varus himself is kind of in the middle. So he rushes forward to see what the heck is happening. And he recognizes very quickly that they've been ambushed and that this is a bad situation. And so he orders his troops, rather than to stand and fight for too long, he orders them to march forward. Now this is interesting. Normally, human nature, if you get into an ambush, human nature is to run the opposite direction because it's what you're familiar with. It's very difficult when you're in an ambush to press forward into unknown territory. It's not easy to do. But that's what Varus does, because Varus has in his head that he still has to head northward to stop this rebellion that's not even occurring. So he's still going to head northward. They eventually break out of this ambush, but with a pretty substantial loss of Roman life. But they make it out, and they're in a kind of a clearing type area. And that's where Varus says we have to set up our fortifications. And what's cool about the Romans is they had almost prefabricated walls and things like that. Every Roman soldier carried an entrenching tool, which is like a shovel and a pickaxe combined. And they really quickly dug trenches, and the dirt that they used from the trench, they built up to create a wall. And so at the end of day one, they dug themselves in to defend themselves. It starts to rain a lot. And the Romans are frustrated because they believed that they could defend themselves even behind the walls with their bows. They had bows, but when it rains, their bows don't work because the strings are made of sinew. And when that gets wet, it's like wet leather, and it just stretches, but it doesn't have enough force to fling an arrow. It just goes doink, and it's not effective. So the Romans are hiding behind walls, but they really can't effectively defend themselves because they can't shoot back. So what Varus does, which isn't a dumb idea, he's told, you got to get out of here. And just so you know, Arminius is a traitor. He'd been warned, chose not to believe it. So what happens is this.
Wait, so the Germans had slings and
A sling will still work. Because it doesn't require pulling, all right? It just works through centrifugal force. But a bow, you actually have to draw back. And what happens is you're not getting any curve from the wood of the bow. It's all just this. It's almost like putting a rubber band on the end of it, all right? So a sling will still work. So here's the deal. Varus knows we're in an untenable position. This is not defensible. So he makes a smart move and a dumb move. The smart move is he's going to break camp silently. He's going to sneak away. The problem is he sneaks in the wrong direction. He sets up, he's here, he moves northward into a much bigger clearing, and then he builds a bigger fortification. He still believed he could stop this rebellion in Germany. And so he was still heading north when he should have headed towards safety. So he builds on day 2, they marched, they snuck away, they built a fortification in the middle of a big field, which is a good spot, but it's still heading northward. The second day, not much happens. It's still raining though. And so what Varus decides is he's going to continue his march northward. Right? This is you get it. This is being silly. But that's what he's doing. And he heads northward and he gets himself into a situation on day 3. And you can see the battlefield. Here he is marching his troops on this road. He gets to a point where there's a swamp here, tons of trees, a mountain, and he gets here and it starts to funnel his troops. And you know from the Battle of Thermopylae what happens when you funnel troops. Only a few of them can engage at one point, and you move a lot slower. Well, what Varus does is he puts initially his cavalry out front as a screen so they can see what's going on, which was smart. The cavalry makes it through here. Varus makes it through here. Most of the troops are here, including the baggage and women and things like that. This was a prepared trap. Arminius knew the territory. He knew that this swamp was a place that you couldn't really run to. You would sink. He knew that these trees were hard to get through. Plus, he put a whole bunch of fencing in it to make it difficult for Romans to get away. Then he built up here a huge earthen wall. Now this took weeks to prepare. Weeks to prepare. And the reason that Arminius knew that Varus was going to do this was because Arminius had been trained by the Romans. He knew all of the Romans' tactics. He knew all of their strategies. He knew their strengths. He knew their weaknesses. And he was a close personal friend of Varus. He knew what Varus was going to do. And so he set this trap up. Yeah?
At this point, do Arminius know that, like, Varus is a traitor? I mean,
It's the other way around.
Yeah.
Yes, he slowly started to recognize that. Yeah. It's not going to make a difference. All right? So what happens is they're still trying to head north. All right? There are fewer of them now. definitely less than 20,000. And what's going to happen is when they get past this earthen wall is when the Germans jump up onto the earthen wall and start flinging javelins down onto the Romans. The Romans are looking up at a wall, and the wall was somewhere between halfway up this room to the ceiling. So that's not something that it would be easy to climb up wearing full armor, and you've got a guy up there throwing a javelin at you. And so when this starts to happen, the Roman cavalry, which could have done something possibly, did do something. They ran away. That's not what you want your cavalry to do. Just so you know, all of those cavalrymen were captured eventually by the Germanic cavalry. And so those guys were almost all killed to a man. All right? So there he has no cavalry left, so he's lost his mobility, Varus has, and the Romans turn to try to face the enemy, and there are so many of them. And they just come over this hill, and the Romans have nowhere to go. Nowhere to go. They can't run behind because they're blocked by cavalry. They can't run through the woods because when they try, they run into these fences and the Germans cut them down. They can't maintain their cohesion. Then what happens is Varus, recognizing that he is losing, falls on his sword. This was the proper method of dealing with a loss. You fell on your sword. Right? To fall on your sword, you actually place it up under your armor and you jump on it. He did that, and just so you know, so had his father and so had his grandfather before him. There's genetics involved, apparently. But the officers, recognizing that the Germans had a tendency to torture people, the officers started to all fall on their swords, all the way down to the centurion level. Your centurions are kind of like your sergeants. And even they recognized that they had probably better tried to lessen the chances of being tortured. They began falling on their swords. When the regular soldiers see this, they break and run for themselves. And they're running everywhere. They're jumping into the swamp. They're drowning. They're running in here. They're dying. They're all getting mowed down. There were 3 eagle standards, right? That's almost like a battle flag. 3 of the eagle standards were shoved into the swamp to try to hide them so the Germans wouldn't get them, because this was a matter of pride. All right? They hid those because that was one of the most important things. Almost every single one of these Romans was massacred. Those that were captured, and there were some that were captured, if they were an officer, they were nailed to trees. Their heads were removed, and their skulls were used as trophies and as, well, glasses, drinking cups, and things like that. Their bodies were strewn all about here. As a matter of fact, 6 years later, when the first Roman army came back, they saw these bodies and they buried all of them. But the Romans, some of the Romans who survived were recaptured 40 years later as slaves. 40 years later. It's going to take, just so you know, it's going to take a long time for this information to come back to Rome. Augustus found out about it not because his men came back and said, hey, we're all dead, because guess what? They were all dead. What he got was Varus's head. One of the Germanic tribes who hadn't participated in the battle brought this head back and said, listen, Arminius is rising up against you. We still like you, Rome. Here's Varus's head, by the way. You guys lost a really big battle. Leading, just so you know, leading Augustus to freak out, and for the remainder of his life, wouldn't cut his hair, wouldn't shave his beard, was seen to be bashing his head against walls. This obviously affected him. And he would wake up in the middle of the night and he would yell, Quintilivare legiones rete, which basically means, Varus, I want my legions back, because they're gone, and they never came back. And slowly, slowly, years later, one Roman general, a guy by the name of Germanicus, is going to go back into German territory, not to conquer it. He went in to get, in part, the 3 legion standards. He wanted to get those. They wanted revenge. They eventually did get the 3 standards. But Rome was never again going to claim German territory. It wasn't worth it. There was no reason to be in Rome. They needed their troops elsewhere. This is going to change the shape of Rome. Rome is no longer going to expand to the north because of this. And even much later, in the 1800s in Europe, you're going to have something called the Romantic era. And this is a time period of nationalism. And the Germans are going to look back at Arminius. They didn't call him Arminius because that was his Roman name. They called him Herman. Herman the German. And Herman had saved Germany from Rome. And so in the latter part of the 1800s, Germans looked toward Herman as the ultimate cool German that everyone wanted to be like. It's going to dramatically influence the formation of really the Germanic state. And so this one battle is going to dramatically influence not only the history of Rome, certainly, but the history of Europe and the world. Questions? Yeah.
Is he actually called Herman the German?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a statue to him. Right. But it sounds cooler in German. It's a Herman the German! Okay, that's because that's German. Yeah.
Didn't Germanic tribes invade Rome when it was like collapsing?
Yes. Yeah. Because they could. The Goths, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, things like that. Yeah. I love you all. All right. Talk amongst yourselves.